The 4-cable method is a way to get more control over your tone and get better sounds out of your pedals. In this video, I'll explain what the 4-cable method is, you'll hear examples of the difference the 4-cable method makes to your tone. I'll walk through examples of setting up the 4-cable method, and I'll give you an idea of why it's so useful. I've noticed some other videos make things far more complicated than they need to be, so I'll keep things as simple as I can in this video. Let's start with what the 4-cable method is and what it does to your tone. Let's imagine this is your rig. You have a few pedals and you plug them into the main input of your amp. This is a pretty straightforward setup, and most of the tones you'll get out of this setup will sound fine. But what happens if you want to use your amp's drive channel as well as your delay pedal? You end up with something like this. Bit of a mess, right? Okay, let's turn the delay off and add some reverb. Instead of getting a nice natural reverb, we end up with a distorted mess. Let's look at what's happening and why this setup can cause problems. Let's pretend your amp is a distortion pedal. Would you place a delay or reverb pedal before a distortion pedal? If you've ever done this, you quickly learn that it doesn't give a good result. The delay trails become horribly distorted and becomes messy. Placing a reverb pedal before a distortion pedal turns what could have been a nice atmospheric tone to a noisy mess. It's the same thing with placing those pedals in front of your amp. When you use your amp's drive channel, think of it as a distortion or an overdrive pedal. Some pedals don't work well in front of a distortion pedal. Those pedals also don't work well in front of your amp. The solution is to use the 4-cable method. The 4-cable method allows you to place whatever pedals you want after your amp's preamp stage. In other words, instead of being stuck with your amp at the end of your chain, the 4-cable method lets you move it to any position you want. If you want all of your pedals to go after your amp's drive section, that's easy. Here's what it sounds like with all pedals in front of the amp. Now here's what it sounds like when we use the 4-cable method and place some of those pedals after the amp. While it should be obvious that there's a huge difference between the two examples, the important point to remember is that the only thing that changed between the two examples is the position of the pedals. The settings on the pedals were exactly the same for both examples. That's how much of a difference the 4-cable method can have on your tone. When we use the 4-cable method, the delay and reverb trails sound crystal clear. We end up with a far better tone with more clarity from each pedal. The 4-cable method is set up using something called an effects loop. Not all amps have an effects loop, so I'll show you how to figure out if your amp has one or not. On the back of your amp, look for 2 jacks labelled something like effects loop, effects send, return, preamp out, or something similar. For example, on the Boss Katana, you can see an effects loop label with return and send jacks. On the back of this Marshall, you can see a serial parallel effects loop label, send and return jacks, as well as a mix knob and level boost button. Most amps don't have this level of control, but if yours does, it's great to have. If your amp has an effects send and return jack, you can use the 4-cable method. Let's look at how to set the 4-cable method up. In the first example, we'll use individual pedals. Then after, I'll explain how it works with a multi-effects pedal. The idea is that we'll end up with some pedals in front of the amp and some pedals after the amp's preamp stage. This gives us a lot more control over the tones we get. While there are general rules of thumb for the order pedals should go in, you should let your ears tell you what works best. In my guitar effects course, you'll learn how to order your pedals as well as hear examples of times when the general rules of thumb should be ignored. For this example, let's place the compressor pedal in front of the amp, then place the delay and reverb pedal in the effects loop. The first section is easy to set up. You plug your guitar into the compressor, then plug the compressor into the front of your amp. That's 2 out of 4 cables. We then plug a cable into the send jack on the back of your amp. Think of this cable as the output cable from a distortion pedal. If that's the output from a distortion pedal, the next pedal in the chain is our delay pedal. So we plug it into the input of our delay pedal. The delay pedal is connected to the reverb pedal. We then connect a cable from the output of the reverb pedal and plug it into the return jack on the back of our amp. If we ignore the cable between the delay and reverb pedal, we end up with 4 cables, hence the name 4-cable method. So now we have our compressor in front of the amp and the delay and reverb pedals in our effects loop. We can easily add more pedals to the effects loop, or we can add more pedals next to the compressor. The point is we have far more control over our rig now. When we turn the delay or reverb pedals on, we get crystal clear sounds out of them every time. Now let's look at how the 4-cable method works with a multi-effects pedal. Most multi-effects pedals work extremely well with the 4-cable method. If you have a multi-effects pedal with a send and return jack, it gives you so much control over your rig. Between presets, you can instantly switch pedals in and out of the effects loop with ease. I'll quickly go through how to set up the 4-cable method with a Line 6 Helix, but the method is pretty much the same across different pedals. Check out the link in the description for more examples of different multi-effects pedals. We start off by plugging the guitar into the Helix's guitar in jack. In the sends and returns section on the back of the Helix, you can see there are 4 different effects loops we can set up. To keep things simple, we'll just set one up. Plug a cable into the first send jack. This cable connects to the amp's guitar input. We then plug a cable into the first return jack on the Helix. This cable connects to the amp's send jack. Finally, we connect the Helix's main output labelled 1/4 inch out and connect it to the amp's return jack. Now that all 4 cables are connected, we need to tell the Helix where we want to set up the effects loop in our preset. The way to think about the 4-cable method with a multi-effects pedal is that the amp's preamp stage is the effects loop. In other words, we're placing the amp itself into an effects loop. By placing the amp into an effects loop, we can easily place pedals before or after the amp in our presets. To set this up on the Helix, in an empty position, select Send Return from the options, then select Mono, then Send 1. What this does is tell the Helix that the cable you plugged into the Send 1 position is the start of your effects loop. To close the loop, go to another empty block position, select Send and Return, Mono, then Return 1. We now have our amp's preamp stage in an effects loop. Anything we place before that loop is before the amp, and anything after the loop is after the amp. So if we wanted to replicate our earlier example rig, we would place the compressor as the first effect, then we would have our effects loop, which contains our amp's preamp stage. Then we can place a delay and reverb effect after the loop. If this seems confusing, it's worth noting how much more control we have over our sound. Now that our amp is in an effects loop, we can easily bypass it if we wanted. So for example, if you like your amp's drive tone, you could leave your amp on its drive tone, then if you wanted to switch to a clean channel, you create a preset that doesn't use the effects loop at all. You can use your Helix's amp models for any other tones you want. Then anytime you want your amp to create your gain tone, you add your effects loop back into the preset. The more you play around with the 4-cable method, the more you start to realize how much more control it gives you. You have full control over the position of any effect in your rig. You can even reposition your amp's preamp stage to any position you want in your chain. Follow the link in the description for more examples and tips on the 4-cable method. There are more diagrams you can follow and advice to help you decide if it's right for you. If you found this video helpful, please give it a like and subscribe for future videos. If you've never tried the 4-cable method before and your amp has an effects loop, give it a go and see if you like it.